Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a book that's, it's sparked a lot of debate over the years,
Hmm.
the Communist Manifesto.
Oh, yeah.
We're not just going to, dust off some history here, though.
Right.
We're diving into the ideas from this book that still kind of rivel through the 21st century. Just imagine a book written way back in 1848,
Wow.
just as revolutions are about to erupt all across Europe. And people are still fired up about it today. That's the manifestos for you. So get ready to explore why this text still matters, how its analysis might apply to your world, and maybe even challenge a few assumptions along the way.
It really is fascinating how some of these ideas, still feel so relevant, even in our modern tech-driven world. Marx and Engels were witnessing the raw birth of industrial capitalism. Factories, smog, massive social upheaval, and they were trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah, it's like they were writing the instruction manual for a system that nobody fully understood yet.
Right.
And one of their most famous lines, right off the bat, is the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. What do they actually mean by that?
Well, think of it this way. They believe that history, it isn't just this random series of events,
Yeah.
but it's driven by economic forces and the power struggles between different groups. You've always got those who control what they call the means of production, basically the stuff you need to make and distribute wealth, like factories back then or maybe algorithms and data today, and those who do the actual work. They called these groups the bourgeoisie, the owners, and the proletariat, the workers.
So it's like a constant tug of war
Hmm.
over who gets to call the shots and who gets to reap the reward.
Exactly. And they argue that this struggle has been playing out for centuries, just in different forms. Think about feudalism, where you had lords and serfs. It wasn't just about one king being replaced by another. It was a total shift in how society produced wealth, who controlled the land, and how power was distributed.
Okay, so I see how that historical context is really important. But here's what gets interesting to me. The manifesto doesn't just demonize the bourgeoisie outright.
Right?
They actually acknowledge the role that they played in overthrowing that old feudal system.
That's one of the more nuanced parts of the manifesto. Marx and Engels saw the bourgeoisie as this force of change, pushing the boundaries of technology, opening up global markets, creating these bustling cities. In a way, they were praising this dynamism of capitalism.
So they're recognizing that capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
at least in its early stages, had this revolutionary energy.
Exactly. But, and here's the catch, they believe this very success contained the seeds of its own destruction.
Ooh.
Think of it like a plant that grows so fast it eventually outgrows its pot and starts to wither. The manifesto even says that the bourgeoisie created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together, but can't ultimately control the forces it unleashed.
Now that's a paradox if I've ever heard one. It almost sounds tragic. But how does this lead to the rise of the proletariat? I'm guessing it's not just about workers getting a slightly bigger slice of the pie.
You're right, it goes much deeper than that. The manifesto argues that capitalism actually creates the very class that will eventually overthrow it.
Whoa.
Why? Because capitalism needs this constant supply of workers, what they called wage labor. But as capitalism advances, more and more people are crammed into factories or stuck in these mind-numbing jobs.
It sounds like they're talking about alienation,
Right.
where your work feels meaningless. You're just a cog in the machine. Does that still resonate in today's world with all the talk about automation and the gig economy?
That's a question worth pondering, isn't it? Marx and Engels were writing in a time of smokestacks and assembly lines. But that core idea of alienation, feeling disconnected from your work, lacking control, being exploited, that feels relevant to a lot of people today, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's like they anticipated some of these anxieties that we're grappling with today.
Oh,
But okay, so capitalism is creating this massive class of workers who are increasingly alienated and exploited. What happens next? I mean, the manifesto isn't exactly known for being subtle.
well, they argue that this concentration of workers in factories,
Mhm.
combined with their growing resentment, it creates this powder keg ready to explode. They're working side by side, they're sharing their grievances, they're realizing they have this collective power.
It's like they're unwittingly forging a revolutionary army within the heart of the capitalist machine.
That's a great way to put it. And the more capitalism develops, according to the manifesto, the more this working class will grow in size and become increasingly aware of its own power and exploitation.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all builds towards those radical proposals the manifesto is famous for. But before we get into those, I want to make sure we really understand how Marx and Engels viewed property, because that's where things usually get really heated.
Yeah.
It is crucial to understand what they meant by abolition of bourgeois property. They weren't talking about taking away your toothbrush or your personal belongings.
Right, because that's the image that usually pops into people's heads, like some kind of dystopian nightmare where everyone's wearing identical jumpsuits and eating the same gruel.
Exactly. What they were targeting was private ownership of the means of production. Think factories, land, raw materials, the tools and infrastructure needed to create wealth. They saw this concentration of ownership in the hands of a few as the root of exploitation and inequality.
So it's not about abolishing personal property. It's about changing who controls the big levers of the economy.
Precisely. They argued that this form of property, where a small elite owns the means of production, is inherently exploitative because it allows them to extract surplus value from the labor of the workers.
Okay, I think we've laid a good foundation here. We've got the historical context, the idea of class struggle, the rise of the bourgeoisie and its inherent contradictions, and the creation of this potentially revolutionary proletariat. But the manifesto doesn't stop at economics, does it? It goes much deeper into the family religion ideas.
You're right. They saw all these aspects of society as intertwined with the dominant mode of production.
So give me an example. How would they analyze something like the family through this lens?
Well, they argued that even something as seemingly personal and eternal as the family is actually shaped by capitalism. They saw the traditional bourgeois family as bound up with property and inheritance. It was less about love and more about maintaining wealth and power within a particular class.
Wow, that's pretty radical. So they're saying that if you change the economic base of society, you inevitably change the very structure of the family. I'm curious to hear more about how they envisioned this transformation.
Let's delve into that in the next part. We'll explore how they saw these institutions evolving and what kind of society they ultimately envisioned.
This is already mind-blowing. We're just scratching the surface here, folks. And it's clear that the manifesto isn't just some dusty historical document. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll unpack those even more radical proposals and really get into the heart of their vision for the future. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we're taking a closer look at the Communist Manifesto. In the first part, we kind of laid the groundwork, explored Marx and Engels' ideas about history, class struggle, and the contradictions that are kind of baked into capitalism. But now let's get to the good stuff. The manifesto isn't just an analysis, it's a call to action. It outlines a vision for a radically different future. And that's where things get really interesting and maybe a little controversial.
It's definitely where the rubber meets the road. The manifesto isn't shy about its revolutionary goals. It's not about tweaking the system, it's about fundamentally transforming it.
Okay, so let's address the elephant in the room. When people hear abolition of private property, they tend to freak out. They imagine some kind of Big Brother scenario where everyone's wearing identical jumpsuits and eating the same gruel.
It's important to remember that Marx and Engels were specifically targeting bourgeois property, meaning the private ownership of the means of production, factories, land resources, the things you need to generate wealth. They saw this concentration of ownership as the root of exploitation and inequality.
So it's not about taking away your personal belongings. It's about democratizing the economy. But wouldn't that just make everyone lazy? That's the classic argument against any kind of collective ownership, right? If nobody individually owns anything, who's going to work hard?
The manifesto directly addresses that concern. It argues that under capitalism, the people who work the hardest often get the least, while those who own the most often don't work at all. They believe that a communist society would unleash a different kind of motivation, one based on collective good and shared prosperity.
So it's about tapping into a different kind of human nature, one that's less driven by individual greed and more by cooperation.
That's the idea. They believe that human nature isn't fixed. It's shaped by the social and economic conditions we live in. If you change the system, you change the incentives, and potentially the way people relate to work and each other.
Okay, I'm starting to see the logic here.
Yeah.
But how do you actually get from point A to point B? The manifesto doesn't exactly offer a step-by-step guide to revolution, does it?
It does lay out some pretty radical ideas for transitioning to a communist society.
Yeah.
One of the most famous is the abolition of inheritance. They saw inherited wealth as a way of perpetuating inequality across generations.
That's interesting because it challenges our assumptions about what's fair.
Huh.
We often think of inheritance as a natural right, but they're saying it's actually a mechanism for maintaining class structures.
Exactly. They also proposed a heavily progressive income tax,
Okay.
where the wealthy contribute a much larger share of their income to fund social programs. This, they argued, would help redistribute wealth and provide essential services like education and healthcare for all.
So we're talking about a complete overhaul of the tax system, not just a minor tweak. And they didn't stop there, did they? I mean, the manifesto even calls for the centralization of credit in the hands of the state. That sounds pretty radical to modern ears.
It does sound radical, but their goal was to break the power of private banks and financiers, who they saw as profiting from the exploitation of workers. They believed that a publicly controlled banking system could be used to invest in social good and support cooperative enterprises.
I can see how these proposals would be incredibly controversial, even today. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about challenging some of the most fundamental assumptions about how our economy works.
That's why the manifesto has been both praised and demonized throughout history. It's a document that forces you to confront uncomfortable questions about power, wealth, and the potential for radical change. But it's not all doom and gloom. The manifesto also outlines a vision for a future communist society. And it's actually quite inspiring in some ways.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Paint me a picture. What does this utopia look like?
Well, for starters, it's a classless society. The old divisions between owners and workers have dissolved. There's no more exploitation or alienation because the means of production are collectively owned and controlled.
So no more billionaires and no more people struggling to make ends meet.
In theory, yes. Everyone contributes according to their ability, and everyone receives according to their need. This doesn't necessarily mean everyone gets the same amount of stuff. It means everyone's basic needs are met, and people are free to pursue their passions and develop their talents.
That sounds almost too good to be true. But I can see how this vision would appeal to people who feel trapped in dead-end jobs or burdened by economic insecurity.
It's a powerful vision, and it's important to remember that it was written in a time when the alternative, industrial capitalism in its rawest form, was incredibly brutal for the vast majority of people.
So it's not just an abstract theory. It's a response to real suffering and a yearning for a better world.
Absolutely. And while the manifesto doesn't shy away from the need for revolution, it also emphasizes the importance of education, of raising consciousness, of building solidarity among the working class.
It's not just about storming the barricades. It's about changing minds and hearts. But how realistic is all of this?
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen attempts to create communist societies, and they haven't exactly gone according to plan.
That's a topic for another deep dive, isn't it? The manifesto has inspired countless movements and revolutions. But the question of whether its vision can be achieved in practice is still hotly debated.
I think that's a perfect segue into part 3 of our exploration. We've unpacked the core arguments, the radical proposals, and the utopian vision. Now let's get real. What's the legacy of the manifesto? How has it shaped history? And most importantly, why should we still care about it today, even if we don't agree with everything it says? Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive where we'll tackle these big questions. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've spent the last 2 parts really digging into the Communist Manifesto, its historical context, its fiery arguments, and even its vision of a radically different future. But now I think it's time to step back and ask, what's the lasting impact of this little book? I mean, it was written over 175 years ago,
Right.
yet people are still arguing about it, drawing inspiration from it, even fearing it. Why is that?
It's remarkable, isn't it? The manifesto is like this time traveler. It speaks to the anxieties of the Industrial Revolution, but it also echoes in the debates that we're having today about inequality, automation, and the future of work.
It's almost like Marx and Engels tapped into something fundamental about human nature, about the way we organize ourselves, the way that power operates, that never-ending struggle for resources and fairness. But let's get specific. Did the manifesto actually lead to any real-world revolutions?
Well, it's tricky to draw a straight line from a book to a historical event. Revolutions are complex things with deep roots and multiple causes, but there's no doubt that the manifesto was a powerful catalyst. It gave language and structure to that simmering discontent of the working class.
It's like they provided the blueprint, the rallying cry, for all these different groups that were fed up with the status quo.
Exactly. Think about the spread of socialist and communist parties across Europe. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the manifesto was their touchstone, their shared language.
And of course, there's the big one, the Russian Revolution. I mean, that's got to be the most dramatic example of the manifesto in action, right?
It's certainly the most well-known, and it had a profound impact on the 20th century. But the Soviet Union, as it developed, ended up diverging significantly from the vision laid out in the manifesto.
There's that tension again between theory and practice.
Right. Marx and Engels envisioned this stateless, classless society where power truly resided with the people. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, became this highly centralized, authoritarian state.
So it's fair to say that the Manifesto has been both a source of inspiration and a source of, well, let's call it misinterpretation throughout history. But if its attempts to create a truly communist society have kind of fallen short, why is it still relevant today?
Because the core questions it raises haven't gone away. Think about it. We're still grappling with the consequences of global capitalism, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, the exploitation of workers, the relentless drive for profit at the expense of people and the planet. These issues were front and center in the manifesto, and they're just as urgent now as they were back then.
It's almost eerie how some of their warnings about the excesses of capitalism seem to be playing out in real time.
Absolutely. The manifesto provides a framework for understanding these systemic issues, for seeing the connections between these seemingly disparate problems.
But even if we don't agree with all of their solutions, the manifesto can help us diagnose the problems.
Exactly. It's like this powerful lens that helps us focus on the underlying power dynamics, the economic forces that shape our lives, whether we're aware of them or not.
Okay, I'm getting the sense that the manifesto is more than just a political pamphlet. It's a way of thinking, a tool for analysis.
That's a great way to put it. It encourages us to question assumptions, to think critically about how power operates, to imagine these alternative ways of organizing society.
And that's what makes it so enduring, right? It's not about dogma, it's about asking the right questions. So after this deep dive, what's the big takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they go about their day?
I think the manifesto challenges us to be more aware of the economic forces shaping our world, aware of the inequalities that persist, aware of our own place in the system.
And maybe it inspires us to imagine a different kind of future, one where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, as they so eloquently put it.
That's the ultimate hope, isn't it? To create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, where cooperation trumps exploitation, where the common good takes precedence over private profit.
Well, folks, there you have it, the Communist Manifesto, a book that continues to spark debate, inspire movements, and challenge our assumptions about how the world works. Whether you agree with its conclusions or not, it's a text that demands our attention, our critical engagement, and maybe even a little bit of soul-searching.
It's been a fascinating journey exploring these ideas with you.
And a huge thank you to you, our listeners, for joining us on the deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those brain gears turning. Until next time.